Hello, and thank you for joining us in our first program in the Discover History Month speaker series, which is generously sponsored by the Smiling Cow. Tonight, we are going to learn about what Camden was like in 1884, and we are very privileged to have Walsh History Center Director Ken Gross here tonight to tell us all about it. So if you have any questions during the program, you can go ahead and type them into the chat box or into the Q&A box, and I will read them aloud to Ken a little bit later in the program. Once again, thank you for joining us. And Ken, I'm turning the program over to you now.
Thanks, Julia. Good evening and welcome to the Camden Public Library. Tonight, we are going on a guided tour of Camden, Maine in the year 1884. Our tour guide will be the estimable N.C. Fletcher. We will start with a brief overview of Camden in the 1880s, and then we will try to answer the obvious question, who was N.C. Fletcher and why are we talking about him? And then we'll move on to a slide tour narrated by Nathan Cleveland Fletcher. N.C. Fletcher wrote a history of Camden. To those of you who are familiar with Camden history and what I call the canon, you will be surprised to hear that we are adding a book to the canonical record. And what I mean by canon is that there are 4 basic history books with which you, if you're looking into Camden history, you will become familiar. And I will list the 4. This is John Locke's sketches of the history of the town of Camden, Maine, including incidental references to the neighboring places and waters, not the John Locke, but our John Locke. That is John Locke's history. And then we jump forward 50 years and we come up with what is probably the best book, History of Camden and Rockport by Rule Robinson. It's the best book because he pretty much lifted everything that John Locke had to say and repeated it in this book. This is published in 1907. And then we jump forward another 50 years and Jack Williams published this 2-volume history of Camden. 1907, he picks up in 1907 when Rule Robinson left off and takes it through 1950. And by the way, I have 2 cartons of volume 1. So I want you each to go home with a copy of volume 1 because they're free. I don't know how.
Free books!
And I have 3 copies of volume 2. Those will cost you $25.
They were 30 this morning.
Yes, I know. I'm trying to sell them too. Yes, I've gone down. Yes, okay, 30 for you guys, 25 for the rest of you. And the last book in the canon is Where the Mountains Meet the Sea, published by the Camden Public Library in 2009. And this, in some ways, is the best book because it's illustrated. It's got tons of pictures in it, and it's quite approachable.
Makes a wonderful holiday gift.
$40, $39.99, but I'm rounding it up to $40. So N.C. Fletcher, Nathan Cleveland Fletcher, was a Universalist preacher who retired from preaching in 1855, and we'll get to why he did that. But after he retired at the age of 70, he published a weekly column in the Rockland Opinion, and this is a scrapbook. Somebody, not just somebody, but Rule Robinson himself collected this material and put it in the scrapbook, and Rule Robinson's wife, when he passed away, gave it to the Camden Public Library. This is the material. This is the very material that we use. We scanned it, and Pat Scaling was kind enough to transcribe all of this. So she's a hero. And our other hero is Jane Mackay, who did a lot of research into the deeds, trying to bring life to who this guy N.C. Fletcher was. Let's see, I want to set the pace. My objective, my aspiration is to take you back to 1880. All right, so this is a map. You can see in the center of that circle is the Bayview House. So clearly this was an advertising piece or a piece for the tourists who visited the Bayview House. This is zooming in on the middle of it. This is the world of N.C. Fletcher. And we are going to take a look at these places which are on the map: the Bayview House, the Alden Anchor Factory, the Christian Science Church, the Brook Schoolhouse, the Methodist Church, the Ocean View House, and the Mountain View House. These are all on the map. And okay, if I were visually guiding you, we would rise up through the clouds and we would descend slowly through the clouds and we would be in 1880 Camden. And this is in the middle of Camden. This is the Bayview House, which was on the village green. It burned down in 1917. And it took a few years, but the village green, the land was bought up and donated to Camden to become the village green. And over here in the corner, what's the easy way to zoom here?
There's not.
There's not an easy way to zoom.
Just use your point. Oh, there you go.
So over here in the corner, something I've learned to look for in pictures of the any well-to-do hotel had a livery stable. So that when your guests were arriving by their own carriage and horse, they had to have some place to leave their carriage and horse. Or if they arrived without a carriage and horse, they had to have some place to rest. So I've learned to look for the livery stable that accompanies every good hotel. That stable, of course, is where the post office is today.
You got to zoom back
I
out.
have to unzoom.
Yeah, that's why I was just like, it's not easy.
This is the dining room at the Bayview House. Here's another picture of the Bayview House from a different angle, but this one shows the famous tree up through the porch over there on the left. This is the Alden anchor factory from across the harbor. And again, if you see a building with a row of windows up on the roof, rising up through the roof, that's clearly a factory, because that's how you get light into the factory floor in the days before there was electric lighting. And over here on the right, you see water flowing down. They had a flume to bring the water power over to the trip hammers in the anchor factory. That flume is no longer there, although that is where the Mogunticook River comes into the harbor. This is now the Christian Science Church. It was originally built as a Baptist church, but the Unitarians, the Universalists took it over quite soon after that, and then it's been the Christian Science Church for decades. It did at one time have a very steep spire, and now we have a truncated spire on it. Okay, Pat, what's that?
That's the Brook Schoolhouse.
Yes,
Long funeral home is now.
Pat is doing some intense research on this building. So this building, the town was quite proud of, and they should be. All the other schools in town seem to be one-room schoolhouses, but this one is quite substantial. And
2 rooms.
Hmm?
2 rooms.
Yes, right, 2 rooms, 2 floors. It is now the Long Funeral Home. This building is just gorgeous. I miss this building. I've never, of course, visited it. It burned down in the Great Fire of 1892. But this was the Mogunticook Hall, and it served the same purpose in the very same location as the Opera House today. And the fire burned up this far in Camden and a little bit farther, but it's just beautiful.
You said that's the same location as the Opera House?
Yeah. This is another hotel. This is the Ocean House, which stood right where we are now at the Camden Public Library up on the hill. And this is, we have an 1856 map that has illustrated. So it's the border is all illustrations, and that's where this illustration comes from. So we know that it was a going concern at least as early as 1856. And that's the backyard, what we now call the South Lawn between the Ocean House and the harbor. Another inn, this is now Camden Harbor Inn, but in its day it was known as the Mountain View House. And here is the main street that N.C. Fletcher would have known. This is, you notice all the wooden buildings on the left and the wooden buildings on the right. All the ones on the left and most of the ones on the right burned down in the Great Fire of 1892. But Fletcher was not around for he passed away in 1888. So this is the Camden. When he talks about Camden, thinks about Camden, this is what he's thinking about. Dirt street, carriages, oxen in the street. And this picture You can see this spire on top of the Episcopal Church. I had no idea that they had such a substantial steeple on the top of the Episcopal Church. And that's one of the things I learned from this photograph.
You mean the Methodist Episcopal Church?
This is the true Episcopal Church.
Oh,
Um,
before St. Thomas.
Yes, before St. Thomas, yeah.
And that's the Sea Dog on the right.
Yeah, right, although this is, of course,
Yeah.
the Sea Dog, actually, yes, you're right, because it's a wooden building now, and it was a wooden building then. And you can see poking up above the roof here is the top of the Ocean House Hotel. So, let's see, okay, back to the question, who was Nathan Cleveland Fletcher? You will get some flavor of who he was from his spoken words. Reading his history to yourself doesn't do him justice, so I hope you appreciate that I will be using Fletcher's own words to narrate the tour. Here are the basic biographical facts, some on the screen, and I will read you the obituary from 1886. I was off by a couple of years. Died in Camden, February 5th, 1886, Nathan C. Fletcher, age 79 years, 3 months and 4 days. Colonel Fletcher was born in Newburyport, Massachusetts, was educated at Reedfield and Monmouth in this state, and had his first pastorate as a Universalist clergyman at Lewiston. He preached in Rockland for 15 years. In 1848, he accepted a call to the Universalist church in Belfast and preached there until 1855, when he moved to Camden. He was a member of the House of Representatives from Rockland, East Thomaston in his day, in 1836 and 1837. He was a bank commissioner in 1837 and a member of the Executive Council in 1835 to 1837. And at one time, he was a member of Governor Fairfield's staff, thus obtaining the rank and title of colonel. He was appointed chaplain in the U.S. Navy in 1843. Colonel Fletcher was a gentleman of fine literary taste and extensive reading, and was a graceful writer. You'll see what graceful means in a few minutes. His long pastorals in Rockland and at Belfast evince his popularity as a preacher of the Universalist faith. He was in his earlier life a frequent contributor of prose articles and poetry to some of the leading newspapers and magazines. He was well posted, very much interested in masonry, and was one of the charter members and first high priest of Corinthian chapter in Belfast. He married Lucy A. Prescott of Monmouth in 1829 and had 4 children, three of whom with his wife survive him. Colonel Fletcher was a lifelong Democrat, and his only son, Edwin C. Fletcher, the postmaster at this place, that is Camden. The funeral services were conducted by, I always wondered who conducts the funeral services for a pastor. And in this case, it was Reverend Henry Jones, rector of the St. Thomas Episcopal Church.
Question.
Yes.
If my calculations are correct, it appears he retired at the age of like 48.
Well, he didn't retire. He didn't.
I mean, he left the church.
He left the ministry. Yes, that's a good question. What did he do next? In fact, that is a very interesting question. Let's see, I want to tell you about the bottom of this screen. Setting the scene, in the 1880 census, N.C. Fletcher had quite a household. He was living in the house on Chestnut Street, which I have pictures of, and you've all driven by dozens of times. It's the Furman House now. Some people know it as the McClellan House. But in this household, N.C. Fletcher, age 75, Lucy A. Fletcher, 67 years old, Adelaide, that's his daughter Adelaide, 47, and Annie Fletcher, 27. She was a good bit younger. Neither Adelaide nor Annie married, but they lived together until Adelaide passed away, and then Annie lived on her own for several decades after that. And who is this R.W.E. Thorndike? He's 21 years old. He is a grandson of Nathan Cleveland Fletcher. Ralph Waldo Emerson is the R.W.E. Thorndike. His parents died in 1871 and 1875. So his father died when he was 12 and his mother died when he was 15. And young Ralph Waldo went to live with his grandfather, N.C. Fletcher. So he had quite a household when he was writing this material. All right, I am going to take a sidetrack down to talk about his education and what was a Universalist back in the 1820s. This building on the left is the Universalist church in Rockland from 1820 to 1870, and the building that enormous, handsome church on the right is the Universalist church that they built in Rockland around 1875 or 1876 and took down in 1960. Oh, and down at the lower right, there's an inset there. That is the cornerstone of the big church, and that cornerstone exists at what is now the Unitarian Church on Broadway in Rockland. Yes.
Is that the courthouse?
Yes, yeah, that's the courthouse. Yeah, that's courthouse. In both pictures, that's the courthouse. Yeah, so you can see it took up one of the parking lots for the courthouse. It's an enormous building.
It must have been quite a popular denomination at that time.
It took off, and I've got some history from this book. Universalists, let me hold it up to the camera. Universalists and Unitarians of Maine by Peter Tufts Richardson. He sent me a nice email explaining what life would have been like for a Universalist preacher in the 1830s. So I will share that with you. In fact, I'll share that with you in just a moment. Our N.C. Fletcher had what amounts to a liberal college education, which is a great deal more education than most people got in the 1820s. The early Universalists were self-educated and self-selected, and that was a core part of the philosophy and strength of the Universalists. And as I said, I'm going down a side path to talk about, I think it's important to understand who were the Universalists and who was N.C. Fletcher. The difference between the Universalists and the Unitarians is sort of an example of the two mains. Universalism was extremely egalitarian and a sort of frontier religion of the inland towns, whereas Unitarians were more of the establishment and had close links with Boston. The Unitarians tended to be strong on the coast and the river towns and were the mill owners and shipbuilders, and the Universalists were stronger on the inland or frontier towns. So in trying to reconstruct the life of a New England preacher in the 1830s, I was fortunate to get this email from Peter Tufts Richardson, who wrote that history. Richardson says it was a ministry by horseback. Most preachers had a central church and preached at every church within a 12-mile radius. The Belfast church shared its preacher with Camden. The Camden circuit shared Camden ministers with churches in Union, Hope, and South Hope, as well as Appleton, Lincolnville, and Rockport. So this guy, N.C. Fletcher, knew everybody in Knox County and Waldo County. Richardson also notes that well over half of the first 25 Maine governors were Universalists or Unitarian. So that may have been our N.C. Fletcher's connection with Governor Fairfield. Fletcher served on the cabinet of Governor Fairfield and was given the honorary title of colonel. So here is the text of that email. Peter Richardson, what's next there? Okay. It would be good to know of the Knox County churches, as doubtless Nathan Fletcher preached in most, if not all of them. It was also the practice in Camden that the minister there served the two little churches in Hope. Nathan Fletcher was typical of the period where most of the Universalist ministers were circuit riders and preached around, as well as having a home base in a local congregation. Universalism came into Maine as a breath of fresh air in contrast to the Calvinism of the Baptist and the Orthodox Congregationalists and the revivalist and evangelicalism of the Methodists. This is, of course, a Unitarian preacher who wrote this history, so you may hear that in what he had to say. Nearly all the early Universalists were converts from either the Baptists or Methodists, a few from the Congregationalists. These four were the basic mix in various proportions in nearly all towns in Maine. It appears Nathan Fletcher came to us from the Methodists, as his education was in Reedfield. The Reed Field, that is the school that became Kent's Hill, started off as a Wesleyan institution, that is a Methodist institution. The Universalist message was simple, based on the metaphor, God is love. The theory went like this: since God created humanity, he would not allow his creation to suffer dire punishments in hell. All are saved and reconciled to their maker. To be otherwise would reflect negatively on the character of God. The Universalists back then were strict believers in the revealed nature of the Bible. On this basis, they were also Unitarian in their theology, as the Bible does not support the idea of a Trinity. The movement spread like wildfire in Maine and only began to wane when the other denominations began to take on the idea of a loving God. So they won, which means that they were no longer a leader or a standalone. So that sort of answers what you were asking about. In other words, when their gospel persuaded the others to soften theirs, then they coalesced with others through intermarriage, mergers, etc. Some continued and consolidated around the larger meanings of the word universalist. Let's see, let me skip down to Sylvanus Cobb. Universalist preachers would have got their training from a leader in the field rather than going to a seminary. So Sylvanus Cobb served he was basically the leader who taught Nathan Fletcher his universalism. Sylvanus Cobb served the Waterville, Oakland congregation for 8 years before moving to the more sedate environs of Malden, Mass. He was the first to preach universalism east of the Kennebec River, carrying his church founding activities all the way into New Brunswick across from Calais. He preached often in Union, Thomaston, Rockland, Camden, Lincolnville, and Belfast. More than anyone else, he, that is Sylvanus Cobb, gave them the boost needed to organize. His autobiography is a great read if you want to understand the freewheeling nature of religion on the Maine frontier. It is not surprising that Nathan Fletcher journeyed to Malden to learn the ministry. Like most ministers at the time, income, at least cash, was minimal and pay was by the Sunday. So they preached around circuit riding often as much as half the time. Maine farmers had no cash. Usually ministers too had a large garden for year-round supply, cut their own firewood to keep warm in winter and to run the cook stove, and raised hay for a cow and a horse. Very likely Nathan Fletcher had several trades to supplement his work as a minister and a hardworking wife. That's all from Peter Richardson. So what did our N.C. Fletcher do when he retired from preaching? For one thing, he wrote a lot, and all of his obituaries mention his graceful writing, as you will see. But for a career, he invested, first of all, in the lime industry, and when that enterprise settled out, he went into pharmacy. And you'll see on the far wall there's an ad for N.C. Fletcher's pharmacy, and 2 pages over is an ad for the E.C. Fletcher's pharmacy. E.C. was his son, and I'm not sure who got into the trade first, perhaps E.C. Fletcher, and then N.C. picked it up. So were they colleagues? Were they competitors? I can't tell. I can't read between the lines enough to figure that out. But they both had a pharmacy in Camden. In fact, E.C. Fletcher built the brick building that is now Boynton McKay. Boynton McKay was a pharmacy right from the beginning. I couldn't for the longest time bridge that change from him being a poor preacher to being a large landowner. He played with the big boys. He was a partner with a growing industry, that is the lime industry. So apparently it was all about connections. After all, he was known as Colonel Fletcher. He was on the Governor Fairfield's cabinet. He was also on the banking commission. He served as a representative from East Thomaston. So he knew absolutely everyone, and as a respected minister, he was trustworthy. But the real connection was his son-in-law, Captain William H. Thorndike. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and it's time to turn to the annals of Camden and let N.C. Fletcher take over as tour guide. As I said, the aspiration is to let the photos and the text work together. So the photographs will be as you see, but the eyewitness descriptions from N.C. Fletcher just adds life, I hope, to these photographs that come from 150 years ago. All right, there's the first page of the annals. Questions before I dive in? You're now about to hear the voice of N.C. Fletcher, the annals of the town of Camden, Maine, from its first settlement to the present time by N.C. Fletcher. To the editors of the opinion, after due reflection upon the subject, which has so long been the topic of conversation in our leisure moments in your sanctum, I have reluctantly yielded to your solicitations to write a series of articles for the opinion entitled The Annals of Camden. The tracing of historical records through a series of years is a task not to be coveted, especially when they are like barren fields and yield but a spare crop to reward the historian for his labors, and but little is left for the patient gleaner who follows in his footsteps. And when but a small portion of the history of a town has been written, oral testimony must be resorted to, and this so conflicting and unreliable that one might as well draw on his imagination for his facts and his memory for his wit, and save all the trouble which must arise in the attempt to harmonize them. But whether they be facts or fancies, they must be duly considered, the chaff sifted from the grain, and what is deemed worthless thrown aside, and that which appears most reasonable and truthful be retained. Well, I hope you can hear a preacher from 1830 and what he's saying here. So the annals take a quick tour through the early history of Maine, and I won't go through that because I want to get to Camden, but I do want to share with you another sample of the flavor of his writing when he's talking about the treatment of the Native Americans. I stated in a former chapter that Captain Pring found no Indians in the vicinity of Camden, either on the islands or on the mainland, which he first visited. But Captain Weymouth met with a great number, and his conduct towards them was not much to his credit. These simple natives of the forest received these Christian, Europeans with open arms, welcomed them to these shores, admitted them to their wigwams, and placed implicit confidence in their protestations of friendliness, only to be deceived, cheated, and wronged, as all others have been who ever have come in contact with the Saxon race. The English, true to their instincts, have ever proved to all other nations a selfish, grasping, and treacherous people, and whoever in their simplicity have placed any confidence in them have done so to their sorrow, and been left to mourn over the sad consequences of their folly, whether they have belonged to a savage or a civilized race. He goes on for another half a page that way. It's in some ways, it's actually much better reading it out loud than reading it to myself. So the annals were published serially over the course of more than a year, which means that Fletcher jumped around a bit from one episode to another. And this presentation will pretty much follow Fletcher's presentation. Fletcher starts on a tour of Camden, starting at the mouth of the Meguntic River. So we will benefit by that organizing principle after we do a little more jumping around. He says, I should do injustice did I not include in these annals the history of the inhabitants of the islands, which lie in the immediate vicinity of Camden, as the constant intercourse between them, that is the islands, and the mainland by regular packets, constitutes them near neighbors, and the trade and traffic between us in the course of a year amounts to a considerable sum. They bring us the products of their fine farms and the treasures which they wrest from their placid waters, which lave their shores in exchange for our merchandise. The islands from which Camden draws considerable trade, and which may justly be called her feeders, are North Haven, Islesboro or Long Island, 700-acre Island, and Job's Island. All these, except the first, form a single town by the name of Islesboro. So that's an acknowledgement that back in Fletcher's day, the islands were not, this is something I have to see over and over, the islands were not between, there was no barrier between us and the islands. If you had a boat, it was easier to get to the islands than to get to get on a wagon and go 8 miles inland. So this is my way of saying that the community of Camden included the islands much more than today. The town of Camden is situated on Penobscot Bay in the county of Knox, 8 miles above the city of Rockland, and comprises within its limits 4 thriving villages, viz. Camden, Rockport, West Camden, and Rockville, all of which have post offices. That's a key feature. These villages have post offices known by their respective names. The 2 latter are in the western part of the town and are known as the rural villages. And I'm going to zoom out because you can't see a darn thing at this scale. Let's zoom in. I'd like to zoom in a little further, but that seems to be the limit, alas. So this, which you will recognize perhaps being west of Rockport as West Rockport, that says West Camden. And down here is Rockville, which we call Rockville. And this map was created in 1890 because Camden and Rockport were about to be split in 2. So that's the dividing line, a proposed dividing line. The final line, take the big jog here because you see this little thing here, that's the quarries, the Jacobs quarries, and the owners of the Jacobs quarries at this time lived in Rockport, and they wanted it to be part of their town. So this nice straight line becomes a wicked jag up around the quarries. And if you've seen them, you may have wondered why there's a jag in the line. That's why.
The Jacobs quarries are the Camden dump now.
Yes, yeah.
Why did the town split up?
It was about money. Rockport, as I understand it, Rockport built I think the Iron Bridge, and it was so expensive that all of the citizens had to pay for it. And the citizens of Camden Harbor did not want to pay for Rockport's bridge, and so it caused friction. And the boys of Rockport used to throw rocks at the boys of Camden and vice versa, so it was. Yeah, right, you shake your head, I shake my head. This is, let's see. Camden is the largest town in this state and contains nearly 5,000 inhabitants. It is in the latitude of 44 degrees 16 minutes north and longitude 69 degrees 48 minutes west by observations taken by Captain Isaac W. Sherman of the ship Raphael of this town in the summer of 1883. So there he is, Captain Sherman of Sherman's Point, and his ship being launched in Rockport in 1875. I did not intend when I commenced this chapter to make a specialty of Rockport, but only to settle the matter as to whom the honor belonged of being the first trader in the town and correct a matter of history, which I have done from evidence which cannot successfully be disputed. But as I have stepped upon its outskirts, I will ascend upon one of its elevated plateaus to take a cursory survey of this weird, romantic, and thriving hamlet until I can afford more time to scan its outlines more critically and interview its citizens and become better acquainted with the hopes, prospects, and intentions of her industrious and thrifty people. The best location for one to take a panoramic view of this village is at the residence of Joseph H. Gould, Esquire, at the head of the harbor. Picture, oh yes, there's a picture. So this is the bridge as N.C. Fletcher knew it. This bridge was replaced by the Iron Bridge, and you'll see it in subsequent pictures in, I think, 1884. And that's Amesbury Hill up there, and you can see the sidewalk which winds its way up and still does today. It's still there. At my right hand,
Which bridge is it? This is in Rockport?
this is the Rockport
Okay.
bridge where the harbor is to the left,
Yeah.
and that's the bridge. Even the Iron Bridge is gone.
Yeah.
At my right, looking towards the south, stretching along in the same direction, is Amesbury Hill with its attractive cottages with their white walls shimmering in the rays of the morning sun, while the ascent to them by winding stairs up the rugged declivity reminds the religiously inclined of the ladder which Jacob saw in his dream, while angels descended and ascended upon it. At the base, the road leading to Rockland winds along gracefully the whole extent of the village until we reach the extensive shipyard of Carlton, Norwood and Company. And this is what I like about the eyewitness report. He tells us what he hears: the incessant clattering of the carpenter's tools upon the ship of over 2,000 tons burden, which is now in process of building, falls harmoniously upon the ears of the passing traveler. And so this ship may be the very ship that he was describing, because it was launched in 1884 and would have been on the ways during the time he was writing these passages. From this point, traveling north towards the bridge, bridge.
From this point to the Iron Bridge.
Yes, this is the 1885 was the date attached, so if it was built in 1884, everything makes sense. I'm missing a picture. That's no problem. From this point, traveling north toward the bridge which spans the stream, are mechanic shops of all descriptions, including steam power and lime kilns. That's what this smoke is, and of course, there was a time exposure, so that this smoke obscures more than it would have actually. But you can see any source of smoke was the kilns. What else does he have to say? Lime kilns sending up their wreaths of smoke as black as Erebus, until it loses itself in the pure atmosphere which is ever sweeping over the elevated hills in the rear, or walled up or wafted up the harbor from the murmuring waters of the bay. On turning towards the east, I discover numerous pleasure yachts dancing upon the waters of the pool, and further on by the riverside are the lines of ice houses. Somber and forbidding, with no windows to admit a ray of light, but which contains the frozen fluid to cool the parched tongues of the denizens of a torrid clime. And here lie the ships ready to convey it to any part of the world where there is any demand for it. This is a great picture. It has a 3-masted schooner on the lime kiln side in the near side, and there's a 2-masted schooner in the middle, and there's a 4-masted schooner loading up with ice to take down to Boston, New York, and even as far as the Caribbean. At the entrance to Rockport Harbor is Indian Island Light, whose twinkling beacon guides the mariner to his destined port.
Does that have a thesaurus?
What's that?
He seems to have read the thesaurus.
Yes. It's definitely consumed the thesaurus, yeah. This is what every obituary referred to his graceful writing, and this is what they mean by graceful writing back in 1860. On entering Rockport Village, as you pass along in a northeasterly direction, he's backed up and gone what we call Route 1, and we're heading in that way. The first object which meets your eye is the Hoboken Schoolhouse, a modern structure of fine appearance, spacious enough for the wants of the district and always kept exquisitely neat. This speaks well for the people of the district, as well as for the youth who gather there to fit themselves for a useful and happy life. The picture's from a little bit later, because you can see the trolley line, which didn't exist in Fletcher's day, but the concept is still there. Presently, you reach the bridge. There we go. Presently, you reach the bridge built in 1884, which spans the Goose River stream and enter upon the main business street of the village. On your left, you see a large, somber-looking block of 2 stories in height, used for stores and dwellings. but has more of the appearance of some dreary prison house or Bastille where dangerous prisoners are kept for security to prevent them from injuring themselves or others. It was built many years ago by Dr. Joseph Hughes, a popular physician of this town, whose foresight did not extend much beyond his nose. And I'm not entirely sure which building he was referring to. I think that you take a right-hand turn and then on your left is the building which is now the architect has his office at the top. It was a Masonic hall at the top. But I think in Fletcher's day, it was a two-story blank wall. You may remember it as the corner restaurant there. On winding around this dreary looking building, the eye rests upon a handsome and more imposing block of brick buildings, and the contrast is so great that it almost makes us forget the architecture of the dark ages of the one and cause us to pause and view the neat and modern style of the other. This block is 3 stories in height and spacious enough to convene the large business transacted by Carlton Norwood and Company and their sons, and for a spacious hall for the accommodation of the town called Union Hall. The next block in the 3rd story, St. Paul's Lodge, free and accepted Masons held their regular meetings. And then up the street, but a few rods distant, stands. Oh, I just inserted this because I love this picture. This is looking back down the hill, and that's the harbor is to the left, but through, and that, again, that smoke is caused by a lime kiln. This square structure here is the square here, that's the kiln on the near side of the harbor. And over there is the Belknap being built in 1883. Then we get to the Carlton Hotel, the only public house in Rockport, and you'll see that down here. I don't know if you can read that, but it says livery stable. So every prestigious hotel had to have a livery stable, and that was.
Where is that located?
Excuse me.
Where is that located?
That's right where the library,
Part of the library.
Rockport Library is now. Yeah.
Gosh.
At this point, 3 roads, at this point, right on the road, at this point, 3 roads branch off in different directions. The center one leads to the celebrated Lily Pond, which yields so much ice, clear as crystal, and is known to all men in every section of our country, where the torrid sun pours down its burning rays upon the devoted heads of those who venture beneath its vertical beams. Wow. And there's a billhead from the Rockport Ice Company. You see the line drawing here of the ships pulled up at the ice warehouse. Lily Pond Ice. It was an enormous business in Maine in general, mostly on the Kennebec River, but here as well. And so this is not that old a photograph, but they were still working with horses and hand saws. And in the words of N.C. Fletcher, but now the fickle winds of winter are sweeping down the mountains and congealing the limpid waters of the lake into a solid substance, and the stalwart laborers, with the aid of their plows and their saws, have converted the waters of the lake into blocks of granite, and the faithful horses have conveyed them to their place of deposit. Then the harvester can rest from his labors for a while, until the genial wind of the south shall waft along the ships to convey the ice which they have gathered to a remunerating market. And that's a graceful way of saying that the farmers had winter work. They could use their horses and their labor, even in the winter when there was no farming to be done. If you turn to the left, you enter Union Street, which connects the 2 villages. There is a sidewalk. And that's something I've noticed in all of these old photos. There's a sidewalk, a wooden sidewalk, and it's in better shape than anything else around. So they absolutely needed, they walked everywhere, and you couldn't walk in the streets in the springtime, in mud season. So that's how people got around on these extended sidewalks. And wood is one thing they had in abundance. The street is lined with pleasant cottages, that is the street from Rockport into Camden. Lined with pleasant cottages or more stately dwellings. Or fertile fields on either hand, upon which to rest the eye when it becomes weary in gazing upon the works of man. Here, that is on Union Street, you have a good view of the lily pond and of the extensive quarries of Carlton, Norwood and Company, of G.F. Burgess and others, till you come to Elm Street, the center of the harbor village. We were known as the harbor as opposed to Rockport. Which with its shade trees and many neat residences is very attractive to the stranger. I will now retrace my steps and take a new departure from the Carlton House, for I am not done with Rockport yet, nor indeed shall I be until I visit her marts of traffic, her hives of industry, and more especially to take a view of that splendid ship which I see looming up in the distance on the stocks. For I have a fancy for a trim ship, well modeled, with a good cutwater, a clean run, and which leaves no dead water in her wake. And here I will jump to the next chapter, in which Fletcher walks from the top of Chestnut Street down into town. Also take a quick look at the
That
time.
house still there?
What's that?
Is that house still there?
That house is not there anymore. This is the name of Ogier's Hill, which is now owned and occupied by the descendants of the original settler, will be known and remembered as long, which will be known and remembered as long as the pendulum of the clock of time shall vibrate. I shall not now climb this hill, but leave the task for another chapter, for I see Stonyhurst, this is Stonyhurst above me, the fine summer residence of Mr. Alfred M. Judson of New York, and on whom I must first call and pay my respects. Chapter 22. I am gazing up at Stonyhurst. It is a large square mansion, 2 stories in height, on the top of which is a dome of modern architecture with its tapering flag staff extending far upward through the blue ether of heaven. It looks graceful. It is about 3 years, I think, since he purchased Stonyhurst of Mr. Joseph W. Ogier at the head of Chestnut Street. The lot contains 21 acres and in its natural state was as rugged and forbidding a lot as nature in her wildest moods ever formed. But where one discovers beauty in a landscape, another sees nothing but deformities, and Mr. Judson happily saw attraction in Ogier Hill, which had lain unobserved by others for a century or more. The mansion is situated on the highest elevation for a dwelling between the villages of Camden and Rockport, and has an unobstructed view of each of them, as well as the surrounding country at every point of the compass. So it's hard, I've seen pictures and heard descriptions like this, it's hard to imagine no trees, because from the top of that hill, you could see everything, and now you can't see anything. I'm the only one in Maine to say, we got too many trees in Maine, we could do with fewer trees.
So was that on the left or the right when you're going up Chestnut Street?
As you're going up the Ogier brick house is on the right, and this is on the left.
Oh, so it was over there.
Yeah, and there is a nice stone cottage there. That was the gatehouse for Stonyhurst. It burned down, according to Chris Glass, it was burned down for insurance purposes in the 1970 or early late 60s. So I don't remember it, I haven't seen it. This is a view from that vicinity. This one is labeled view from Judson Cottage. This is a bit later. This is taken by Teresa Parker Bad in her series. Another view, let's see, where are we? Opposite the island on the mainland is the Ogier. He goes on for a long description of the Ogier farm. And I thought I would, oh, this is a great map because the names have not changed since 1799. This map is an overlay that Sam Manning did on a geodetic survey map. So you have both the modern features and the original lots laid out by the 20 associates. So you can see that this Jacobs. Notice that it runs from the shore to the quarries. Jacobs hit the jackpot. He had both quarries and shorefront property in his lot. And this is where the kilns are, and you'll see this street which stretches exactly from the quarries. Believe it or not, that's Lime Rock Street. What else could you call that street? And
Yeah.
that's where they carted the limestone from the quarries to what became N.C. Fletcher's quarry, kiln here on the shore. The Gross Farm is referred to in the history, and he had a small quarry here called the Gross Quarry, no relation to me. And here's the Osier lot. The text refers to, it runs from Dillingham Point, where the soil was terrible, up to Lily Pond, where the soil was really good. So he had a farm. The most productive part of the farm was back here. And oh, this is my favorite quote. My favorite quote of the whole thing. Let's see if I can find it. The Osier farm may strike the stranger as he passes along it. It is nevertheless a very fruitful farm, and its owner is always sure of raising a fair crop. It is well watered, stands a drought remarkably well, and is the last locality in this vicinity that ever the frost reaches. Its arable land lies in the vicinity of the lily pond and is very prolific. The fields near the shore are better fitted for grazing and yield abundantly, but oh, the rocks. The farm is walled in, but what puzzles the stranger is to know where they get all the rocks on Chestnut Street to build their walls, for he doesn't miss any from the surface of the ground. It is a very strong land, said an old farmer to me one day when I first moved into town. That is self-evident, I simply replied, for had it not been, it could never have sustained so many rocks upon its bosom. So I'm impressed by the rocks in that picture in particular. And you don't get a view like that because it's full of houses and trees.
Is that Chestnut Street on the left?
That's Chestnut Street, yeah, upper Chestnut Street.
Whoa.
What happened to the trees? Used for the boats?
Yeah, they used it for firewood. You know what was sucking up all the trees for firewood is the kilns. You had, it took 6 or 7 cords of wood to fire the kiln. They were bringing in firewood on schooners from as far away as Nova Scotia to feed the kilns in the Rockport and Milton. And so, and I look at the mountain, it's much more bare back in 1870 than it is today. Partly, but it's my theory, and I haven't talked to a geologist about this, but you know, it was scraped bare 10,000, 12,000 years ago. It's starting from bare rock. You had to build up soil, starting in the lower part, and so gradually over thousands of years, the soil has been creeping up the mountainside. So if I showed you a modern picture, it would be just bare rock at the very top, but most of that would be green. There's another picture with the rocks, all the rocks. I am about entering on a voyage of discovery from the entrance of Camden Harbor to the winding stream of the Magunticook River, from its outlet to its source, and will avail myself of all the light obtainable, and let its rays flash their brilliancy upon the dark and intricate passages which I may encounter on my way thither. But what light shall I use? Why, I will use the one that emanates from a little conical building standing upon the outer walls of a gem of an island at the entrance of Camden Harbor. Yep, that's the lighthouse. And then he goes on for a page and a half using Christian metaphors and symbolism about the lighthouse on the shore. So you can imagine that. I could even sing you the song. You know the one I mean? I can almost get it, but I won't. Sometime I'll share it with you. What is my next picture here? Finally, we arrive at the part of the narrative that brings in the quarries. Let me jump ahead to show you. This is the not 1875, it's on the 1856 map, the residence of N.C. Fletcher. So remember Jacobs, this was Jacobs' house. Jacob sold his property to Witherspoon, and Witherspoon sold it to Thorndike, and Thorndike brought in all his partners, including N.C. Fletcher. Anyway, Fletcher wound up with this gorgeous house, and that's the house today. You've been by it. And it looks like that then. It had a, a railing around the top. And it looks like a flat roof. It's not a flat roof. It's a very, it's a little easier to tell in the left-hand photo that it's a pitched roof. So I'm going to read a couple of passages. The first from Rule Robinson, and you'll notice a distinct difference in style where Rule Robinson spells out. We spent a lot of time, Pat and Jane and I, trying to figure out through the deeds this thicket of ownership, because he lists six owners, and rather than share the travails that we went through trying to figure out who owned what when, I will read you the summary that Rule Robinson came up with, which was precise and much shorter than what we came up with. The first quarries were small. This is from a summary from Rule Robinson's chapter called Industrial. The first quarries were small and located in various parts of the town, but finally the quarries between Camden and Rockport villages and those at Simonton's Corner became about the only ones worked. The former, known as the Jacobs quarries, had been operated to a small extent prior to 1855 or so, when S.F. Allen of Thomaston opened negotiations to purchase the Jacobs farm, then owned by John Witherspoon. And shortly afterwards, it was purchased by Christopher Young, John Crocker, W.H. Thorndike of Rockland, and N.C. Fletcher. Fletcher shows up. Henry Lowell and Mr. Allen, who soon began operating the quarries upon it. Mr. Allen took charge, dug a kiln of rock consisting of 500 or 550 casks, burned it, and branded the product Jacob's Lime. From that day, lime of that brand has stood very high in the market. Mr. Fletcher then for a short time had charge of the business, and then the property was partitioned and sold to the various parties in the interest. That's a very succinct and accurate account. And it says that Fletcher, this map was made in 1856. So in 1856, for maybe a year and a half, Fletcher was the manager of the kilns. And so he earned his name on the wharf here. There he is. Fletcher and Company's Wharf. And if I scroll down to the bottom, you'll see N.C. Fletcher at the bottom. Yeah, that is that house that we saw the pictures of. So that's in 1856, the magic date. Whoopty-doopty. Let's see, where do I want to go here? So this is 20 years later, and the quarries are now in the hands of Carlton, Woolwood and Company's lime kilns. This is on Camden Harbor, but still N.C. Fletcher is attached to all of this property. N.C. Fletcher, N.C. Fletcher, N.C. Fletcher, N.C. Fletcher, this large block of land and this little triangle across the street there.
What is that street?
The one on the left is, that's Lime Rock Street.
It's okay.
And it now goes through all the way, there's a street here where I'm showing, goes all the way down to Bayview Street. And this is Chestnut Street that runs north-south here.
The baby is the one on the right, the street on the right.
What's that?
The baby is the street on the right.
Yes, right, and this is just a driveway running down to Portland Steamboat Wharf, which is only in existence for 10 or 20 years at most. The one that most people know of is the Boston Steamboat Wharf, which is where Steamboat Landing is today. All right, let's move on.
But how does a preacher do all that?
That is a great question, and I thought, yeah, he had connections. There's only one connection that mattered. His daughter married Captain William H. Thorndike. William H. Thorndike was one of the big boys. He had just finished building the Thorndike Hotel in Rockland. he married Eliza Thorndike in Belfast and talked N.C. Fletcher into being the front man for his company. And he was, he retired from preaching and became the manager of these quarries for about a year when they figured out that he was not the guy to run the quarries. So here's the same story in N.C. Fletcher's own words, where he refers to himself in the third person. And this is a crucial turning point in the life of N.C. Fletcher, and it answers the question, how did a preacher join in the big boys when it came to participating in this large undertaking? Let's see, it goes on a rant. I will skip the rant. In 1853, a few energetic men from Rockland saw the advantages which Camden possessed over the many towns which had outstripped her in the development of their resources. Captain W.H. Thorndike of Rockland, accordingly, one quiet morning, came to Camden on a prospecting tour, and for 2 days pretty thoroughly examined the lime quarries and the shore privileges at Camden Harbor, and fully made up his mind to invest a little money in real estate in this town. And he was determined in his mind that if the well-known Jacobs Farm could be obtained at a reasonable price with its valuable quarries, he would at once purchase it. This farm contained 160 acres and had been in the Jacobs family since the first settlement of the town. And on it and beneath its soil was the most extensive bed of the purest lime rock in this section of the state. The original owners were of the most prominent families in town, but the tide of time had swept one generation after another of that noted family into the measureless ocean, until but a few were left lingering on the earthly banks. The property had been sold but a few years before for the sum of $4,500. The purchaser was not competent to manage so large a property and was willing to sell it. His price was $12,000, and notwithstanding the enormity of the price asked for the property, Captain Thorndike purchased it. He returned to Rockland, associated with him Fessenden Allen of Thomaston, Henry C. Lowell, John Crocker of Rockland, Christopher Young Jr. of Camden, and N.C. Fletcher of Belfast. The latter was chosen agent of the company. In a very few days, the property was transferred, and the agent, that is Fletcher, removed to Camden in 1854 and took possession of the old Jacobs mansion, which he named the Hermitage. As he expected here to seclude himself from the world, for to him it seemed a desolate spot, after living in a city all his previous days. I'll wrap up. I'm moving towards the close here. I think we have time enough here. The people of Camden, on hearing of this purchase and the price paid for the property, stood aghast and wondered what induced these maniacs to be guilty of such egregious folly. It came upon them like a thunderbolt from a cloudless sky, but it proved rather a sunburst from a sullen sky. They were fully awake now and were born into the newness of life. The cinders were removed from the walls of the old kilns, and the dilapidated kilns thoroughly renovated. The old worm-eaten and barnacled wharves were repaired or rebuilt. And the stranger, as he wended his way slowly to Rockland, would exclaim, "Old Camden is no longer a place to emigrate from."
Ken, what is this picture we're seeing?
This is
Jacob's
the
Quarry?
Jacobs Quarry, which was extremely deep. And you can see it was worked by.
So that's the dump now, where the dump is.
Yeah, yes, where the dump is now. And here's another picture of perhaps the same quarry, and up at the top is Chestnut Street. This is a much later picture because I can see some mechanical devices which they didn't have at the beginning. But that house on the top there, that is Hilltop Acres, the Parker Morse Hooper estate, which is not there anymore and burned down about 1972. But they used to complain that when they had garden parties, they'd be blasting and it rattled the whole house.
And did they have to pump that quarry to keep it dry and hard?
That's a good question. I assume that they must have been. There is a picture of a tabletop steam engine, which they probably used to pump pump the water out. This is actually a later picture, but it shows that this is Camden, this is industrial Camden. In fact, this is probably 1900. And the carts and the railroad that it's on were actually electric powered trains, part of the trolley system. Not in, this is probably 20 or even 30 years after Fletcher's day. I am going to move rather rapidly through the end of these because between Fletcher and I, we've been too wordy, and I want to leave some time for questions and answers. But he does refer to, he continues on a tour up the river, and he mentions this Sardine Factory, which I was not aware of until it was brought to my attention by Fletcher. He calls it one of the bigger industrial marts and one of the bigger employers in town, and helped many men and particularly women earn enough to make it through the winter. He also mentions the J&BC Adams Coal, Wood and Hay Market. As he goes up the river, he walks from one to another, and he mentions these one after another. He mentions the Whitmore Lumberyard. Oh, speaking of lime kilns, that's it right there. Let me zoom in and see. That didn't work. That worked. So there's the lime kiln, which is where the yacht club is now. That is the Jacobs and the Fletcher and the Carlton Norwood yard. It's a little hard to discern, but here's a pile of limestone, and the carts would come here and then dump their load in. This is the top of the kiln here. That black is the rim of the chimney.
So the exit to the harbor is to the right.
Yes, yeah, we're looking
It's
at.
very narrow.
Yeah, it is. Well, the harbor is, it's pretty narrow. And then he spends a long time. You guys are gonna have to come back tomorrow night, because I want to read the description of these brawny men. He walked into this factory and shook the hands of these brawny men, and he wasn't afraid of getting his hand dirty because he admired these workers so much. But he has this great description of the work that went on. That is a public landing today. All of these buildings burned down in 1935. They were derelict by that time, but in Fletcher's day, this is a going concern. This is Commercial Street, which has a clear shot all the way to the waterfront. They had a machine in this shop. What they used for iron was railroad iron, scrap iron. And they had a machine which would take a rail and nip it, just cut it into and make it into chunks so they could throw it into the vat. Yeah, it's astonishing. There's a couple of pictures. These are from the diorama upstairs, but it takes you right in. That's what was going on in Camden Harbor. This refers to the Water Powers of Maine, which was published in 1869, in which Fletcher was careful to say they asked his opinion as well. So his work appears. They list all of the privilege. Privilege is the name of the right to build a dam on a piece of river. There was a legal recognition that whoever owned the privilege had the right to build the dam there. So rather than calling them dam sites, they call them privileges. And those are 7 of the remaining dams or vestiges of dams that you could find on the river. He mentions the Knox Woolen Company and says, and that's all I have to say about the Woolen Company. It's the only time he was succinct. He only gave it a paragraph. The biggest employer in town gets just, he must have had something against the owners, but he didn't spend any time in the Knox Woolen Company. This scene looked just like that for 100 years. Not this one, though, they added electric lights after a while, but these women were still doing the same job when I walked through with my father.
When was that?
This picture was in 1914, but I walked through in 1960s.
And they were still doing this.
Are still doing the same kind of work. There's two things that the women, so you have a loom and the, what do they call those pieces that move up and down? Each one,
Shuttles.
no, the shuttles go this way.
Treadles?
That I got. Yeah, treadles, yeah. So each thread had to be threaded through a rod with a hole in the middle so that it would travel up and down. And so each thread on this 40-foot wide loom had to be passed by hand through these eye holes in the rod. And that was women's work. And then tying off, when it was all done, they had to tie off the ends, it's whatever pattern they used so that they could tie the ends of the felt together. That's
And
kind
this
of,
was commercial wool, was it? No?
yeah, this was used in the paper industry. They were making enormous, basically conveyor belts for processing paper. So even though it was a woolen textile mill, it was part of the paper industry. Oh, the Oakham factory. You might have noticed that every place he visited was the best and most extreme. And so this was the most, everybody who was involved in the Oakham factory came away rich. This Oakham factory, the yellow line draws to it, was known as the Alden's Oakham factory. There it is on the left. The dam, and on the right is what, if you're standing on the Moulton Street Bridge and looking downstream, you see this, you see rocks almost making it across. That's the remnants of this dam on the left. But it was a going concern for decades. And of course, they made the best oakum on the market.
What is oakum?
Oh, it's a strand of what is oakum made from? Hemp.
Yeah,
Impregnated with tar, so it's sticky and it gets pounded into. It gets pounded into the cracks. It's in shipbuilding, mile after mile. Every crevice between the planking was pounded full of this oakum. And then when the ship went into the water, the wood swelled up and sealed it from leaking. And then we moved on to the Moulton Brothers, where he spends a lot of time. There's a map of the Moulton Brothers, who had a foundry, a machine shop, a blacksmith shop, a block shop with planing, sawing, and turning. And over to the right is a carding mill closed, which was part of the oakum factory. And there is a picture of the 1883 in Fletcher's heyday. There's the men standing out on Mechanic Street. Knowlton Street goes up to the right, and there's a close-up of these guys. There is what,
that's the tannery.
yes, I think it is the tannery, but that's the site of the Gould plug mill, and it's at the base of Gould Street. Yes, how am I doing for time? How am I
We gotta wrap it up.
Okay, here we go. We're going into the lightning round. The Bisbee powder mill. Why did we need so much gunpowder? It was for the quarries. They did a lot of blasting, and so there was a fellow famous, referred to many times, Robert Duffy, never lost a man in this dangerous trade. The guy before him lost 3 guys in an explosion, and he makes some remark about nobody goes to visit the powder factory. They have a pretty quiet life there. And this is all the way up at the head of the McGonagall. This is a rare picture where you can see both the east and west dams at the McGonagall at the same time, because it's all filled in with trees now. And there's the dams as well. And of course, he goes to summer cottages, and we're not going there. But I would read this, not covered tonight, church history. a choice quote. Next to family quarrels, church quarrels are the most unreasonable. Perhaps he knows what he's talking about. The method of settling a minister in early times was an incongruous one. The inhabitants of a town constituted his parish, and a mass of minds was placed under his moral and religious instructions, which he was expected to control. It was a hopeless task, and no man ever yet accomplished it, never will, and I may say never ought to attempt it. It has been tried many times, and the result has proved a miserable failure and produced more hypocrites than Christians. So,
A lot of ease.
I do get a kick sometimes out of Nancy Fletcher. And here's our final picture, because he goes on, of course, for a page and a half on this Victorian story about the death of poor young Eleanor French on Main School. So we have a couple minutes for questions.
Yes, does anyone in the audience have questions? And at the same time, I invite anyone on Zoom to please go ahead and type them into the chat box or into the Q&A box, and I'll read them aloud.
Question? Are there
Yes.
photographs of the lake? Or did you sort of stop at the end of the town?
I don't have photographs of the lake in this slideshow. This is a line drawing of the lake.
Yeah, are they? But I mean, this Fletcher's, the animals, how far up was now Washington Street did the animals go?
Right, he was happy when he reached the lake. He was done.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jory.
Could you say a few words about the indigenous inhabitants of the area and what happened to them?
Fletcher does not say much more. He does interview an aging Native American who told him, Fletcher asked him why Negro Island was called Negro Island, and this guy made up some story I've never heard before or since. He was happy to entertain the preacher with his story. From my recent reading, in the 1600s, when the first white man arrived, it was the Wawanocks who were here. The Wawanocks got pounded both by losing a war with the Tarantines, another Indian tribe, and they were just devastated in the plague of 1615 to 1617. So the Wawanocks were no longer around when our guys arrived, our guys being the settlers who arrived in 1769. And whatever natives there were, and there were some who had seasonal dwellings on Eaton's Point, but they would have been the Penobscots. But there's not a word in the Camden record, in the Camden history. It's amazing. It's really hard to suss out the story of who was here, who was right here when the white settlers arrived.
And Maguntacook means harbor by the mountain or something in Indian language?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Ken, I have a question that just came in from Zoom. Sarah wants to know, was NC Fletcher related to the Fletchers who settled Lincolnville, who moved from New Hampshire and among the first settlers on High Street in Lincolnville?
That is a great question, and I've been open to the answer to that, and I don't think so. I think I have not found any connection between the Fletchers of inland. There was a Fletcherville and there's a Fletcher Cemetery, and Fletcher Pond was the first name for Moody Pond. But I don't think there's any connection between our NC Fletcher and those Fletchers.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
We also have a comment. The women at the mill threaded the warp threads through the eyes of the heddles in a heddle frame to lift them in order to run them through the warp thread through.
Oh,
So,
there you have it.
thank you
We got
thank
the
you
terminology.
for giving us that further explanation and clarifying some of that terminology. We appreciate that.
Right up.
It doesn't look like there's any more questions on here, so I'm going to wrap up the Zoom program. And again, everyone in the audience and our live audience, also thank you so much for coming. We have a number of history programs going on this month. We have another one coming up on Thursday, another one after that on Monday. Please check librarycamden.org for all of the details on all of those programs. And we hope to see you again very, very soon. Have a great evening, everyone. And thank you, Ken. This was very, very
Yeah,
interesting.
thanks, Julia.